Hello, my name is Clara Dominguez. My presentation is called 21st Century Men Still Over Women, Inequality. I'm doing my presentation for my Sociology Inequality course. Search Stanford University assault, and the first image that comes up it's the aggressors, Brooke Turner, instead of the victims, Chanel Miller. Miller was going to a party that day. Behind a dumpster, laying half naked and unconscious was Miller, and on top of her was Turner. Two graduate students, Peter and Carl, noticed what Turner was doing to Miller and immediately reacted. Peter chased Turner down and held him down until police arrived. The judge Persky, even though he had a victim, the aggressor, and even two witnesses to say what happened that day, still decided to give Turner a 6-month sentence. And he justified this sentencing by saying that Turner had a bright future ahead of him. He was young, he was a university athlete. In short terms, that he had a bright future ahead of him. Now, what about Miller's, the victims, present and future? What's inequality? Under the Cambridge Dictionary, inequality means the unfair situation in society when some people have more opportunities, money, etc. than other people. For example, the law has done a little to prevent racial discrimination and inequality. Sexual inequality. There remain major inequalities of opportunity in the workplace. Opposite to equality. In the Britannica Dictionary definition of inequality, it has it as an unfair situation in which some people have more rights or better opportunities than other people, such as social, sexual, economic, racial inequality. They discuss the problem of inequality between students. He accused the company of inequality in its hiring practice. Now, comparing both definitions, we can just come down to the conclusion that inequality just means as an unfair situation. For my presentation, we'll be focusing under the gender inequality. However, we can just agree that inequality, somebody is always higher than the other person with higher power. Why does gender inequality exist? Is a question that even though one might just see it as a simple question, it actually comes down with a lot of different answers. As discussed in the previous slide, inequality is an uneven situation where someone else with the higher power is in control over the other person. Now, why does gender inequality exist? Can be due to multiple factors, such as family, culture, religious norms, biological views, and just overall how society sees males above females. It all comes down to how individuals are raised in their households, involving families, culture, their religious views, biological views. It's not a secret that males are seen as the stronger, taller, etc. ones, in comparison to the males are seen as petite, smaller, the weak sex. Violence. We cannot talk about gender inequality without talking about violence. As the quote from the Conceptualizing Violence and Gender in the chapter, it says, violence is a kind of social relationship between perpetrator and victim in the sense that both perpetrator and the victim are necessary to the event. Meaning that in this equation, you need a perpetrator and a victim in order to have violence. So for this scenario, the perpetrator will be the male and the victim, the female. Variations in violence. There's 3: seriousness, repetition, and duration. Starting off with seriousness. Is the action aligned to the harm that is being done to the victim? The intention of the perpetrator is what affects the seriousness of what is happening, the gender motivation. For example, the Stanford University assault. We had the male, Brooke Turner, having the victim, Miller, behind a dumpster, unconscious and halfway naked. Turner was on top of her. So we had, of what we can assume, the action that was going on. Of course, Turner wanted to hurt Miller, sexually in this case. We also have the repetition, which is a line between a perpetrator and a victim, as well as one event. For example, domestic violence. So at home, we have sometimes the spouse, the male and the female, having the domestic dispute. So in most cases, we have the male abusing the female. So forming a threat that accumulates the violence. So how is a line between the perpetrator and the victim of the assault that is actually happening during the domestic violence? Lastly, we have duration, how long the incidence of the violence occurs. For example, we going back to the domestic violence example, this harm the victim experiences as a constant state of fear of the aggressor. Units of measurement. It requires to identify the relevant units, which are events, victims, and perpetrators. In most cases, there's only one perpetrator and one victim for each event. However, this doesn't apply for all events, such as, for instance, for domestic violence. Most of the time, it doesn't only occur once, that's multiple times. Counting rules. Counting rules are the official complex that determines the number of crimes that are recorded under police records. The crimes that are actually counted as the police reports. In order to have a correct data, we need to have three important factors. The first one, the date. Having the date the crime took place, even if the date has to be put as an estimate, it has to be closest to the accuracy, because as done in some cases, the date was put as the date that the crime was discovered. This actually distorted the event. Second one, we have the three measurement units: events, victims, and perpetrator. For each of them, it will prevent complexities around other events, crimes, and victims if the information is not put accurately or close to the reality. Lastly, we have principal offense. So the crime should be classified by principal offense, having a hierarchy of offense to categorize each offense, each crime, in a specific category. Gender visibility. Gender visibility is an act in which individuals or communities are being seen, acknowledged for their gender, in which they can express and identify who they are without being judged. There are three main approaches. The first one, invisible. This category is when a gender is not being used or putting as a hold, just being there without being acknowledged. This can be done by the neglect of the own gender. We also have the second one, focus on women. As the category states, it gives the spotlight to the females. An example of this could be when the strong movement of women, when they make their voice be heard to stop violence against their gender. Lastly, we have gender mainstreaming. This is a movement in which it moves the concept of gender discrimination, but in places which the action takes place. This approach can be international, regional, and even national. For example, any services that needs moderations that starts off as males jobs, but females later joined. For instance, police uniform and equipment. This started as a man's job, but we now have females working there with maybe heavy uniform and heavy or big equipment for them. Gender dimension. There's 4 gender dimensions. However, I did put the 5th one, and this sometimes apply, but I'll further explain. So the first one, we have the sex of the victim. This is essential because it's an important factor when it comes to the aggressor toward the sex, the females. We have to identify the victim's sex. The second one is essential, is the sex of the perpetrator. So this is to assist with the motive that the gender of that's actually causing the violence and the aggression towards the victim to identify. The third one is the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, whether the perpetrator was in a domestic relationship, a partner, somebody that the victim knew, or like and somebody that they had a type of relationship with. So this is important because in the dimension of domestic violence, we can see the relationship of the victim and the perpetrator to identify the source and the purpose that this aggression was done. Fourth, we have whether there was a sexual aspect to the violence as well as physical. So we could be talking about rape. So this can overlap in a sense with the third gender dimension. However, it can overlap because this one, the fourth one, is wider. We can actually include the non-consensual sex from someone that's not their partner. Once again, as I stated, it could be rape. So I put the 5th one. This 5th gender dimension sometimes can be applied, and it's in some events it is possible to discern a gender motivation. So meaning this dimension is motivation. So it's difficult to collect this data because it's not usually easy to observe and collect the data from. Gender females gaps in politics. So in New Zealand in 2014, there was a feminist group that spoke loud, making a women's election agenda. So the agenda started off with the strongest domestic violence, following with women's economics inequality, such as access to benefits, superannuation, which is a pension for retirement in the future, pay equity, as well as paid maternal leave. So there is paid maternal leave, however, they wanted to extend it, not just in a short period of time, as well as including affordable childcare, because we know sadly there's a mom and a dad, however, most of the child care, child assistance, and all of that ends up being the mother taking care of that, the children in those aspects. Gender differences, new generations. So, as we can see on the graph, there was a study in New Zealand in 2014. So, we can see by the numbers that there's the elderly females that dislike inequality rather than the new generations. Going back to the 20-year-olds, we can see a significant number of elderly females that dislike inequality rather than the 20-year-olds. And even the 30-year-olds, the number even go lower at a 40-year-old. So it's this information that's kind of shocking, because you would think that is the new generations trying to be equal to the male sex, females and males, but this information says otherwise. Gender gaps political knowledge. So as we can see on the graph, scores 0 through 3. So 0 being the lowest of no interest in politics, and 3 being the highest number in politics interest. So as we can see on the graph, we have the males with a high number of interest in politics, and the females just a little less below male. Now this could be a big factor of the continuation of gender inequality, because at the end of the day we have to understand that in a way or another politics is involved in our daily lives. And now if females are below the male's interest in politics, how can we expect to change when the female's not fully engaged in a type of sense of politics? Conclusion: gender inequality. So what we went over was gender inequality is an unfair situation in which a gender is with higher power than the other, in this case males over females. Where does it come from? So we also discussed that it could come from family, culture, just multiple factors, religions, norms, and all of that. We bring it over into our society and just keep it going, sadly. Violence, so domestic violence, in which we have a perpetrator, a victim, and an event. We also have the gender visibility. It needs to be something that it has to be done by the females, so they can be seen and heard and actually have it change. Lastly, we went over females in politics. So with the given information, we noticed that the females are less involved in politics, and sadly, politics is all around us. So if females are not as involved in politics as males are, it might not be soon that we see a change with gender inequality. And I just want to conclude my PowerPoint with a saying in Spanish. So I just translated into English. So it's: the brave lives until the coward wants.